Welcome to The Call, an exclusive conversation hosted by the Chamber's Global Intelligence Desk. We're delighted you are able to join us. Please note the views of our guests today are not necessarily those of the Chamber, but we hope you will find those views as valuable as we do. Please feel free to put questions into the Q&A at any time, and we'll address as many as we can after the interview. Let's get started. Good morning, and welcome to The Call, brought to you by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Washington. I am your host, Jay Sapsford, and here is today's question of the moment. What geopolitical tensions will flow from a melting Arctic? The receding ice of the North Pole is an environmental tragedy, but this new Arctic is also becoming a theater of great power competition. Russia, China, the U.S., and NATO are all vying for strategic advantage. Among the commercial rewards are the region's fish, minerals, and energy, but maybe the biggest prize is a shortcut over the North Pole. Right now, a ship sailing from Asia to Europe has to go through the Strait of Malacca, the Indian Ocean, and the Suez Canal, but a ship can cut travel time in half by going over the Arctic. Russia controls the most promising passage, but the costs of the Ukraine war and the resulting Western sanctions have hampered Moscow's finances. So to develop its northern territories, Russia is turning to its former rival, China. And Beijing is helping with everything from infrastructure to exploration to joint patrols to satellite monitoring. The German Marshall Fund has published a series of reports detailing this growing relationship, which the Pentagon has said is a concern. With me now is the lead author of those reports, the fund's senior advisor and former president, Heather Conley. Heather, welcome to The Call.
Great to be with you, Jay. Thank you.
I wonder if we might set the table at the beginning by just talking about the environmental tragedy that is the melting Arctic. Is this just simple global warming, or is this happening faster than other regions of the world?
It's actually happening faster. So very briefly, the Arctic is warming 2 to 3 times faster than anywhere on the Earth's surface. And this is causing the acceleration of several issues. Number one, the melting of the polar ice cap. So we see that thick Arctic sea ice diminishing. So it's very thin, they call young ice. It makes the ice very dangerous, but it's dissipating. So that's why the Russians are very keen to use that northern sea route, because they see the ice dissipating and they can ship for longer periods of time. At some point, 2050, 2060, we could see ice disappearing from the central Arctic Ocean, that transpolar shipping that would cross over the North Pole. We're also, though, seeing, and this is really significant for Russia, dramatic permafrost thaw. Russia, about 65% of Russian soil is permafrost. And so what they're seeing is really dramatic thawing of the permafrost, which is releasing methane and carbon dioxide. Those warming temperatures are drying the tundra, so we're seeing dramatic wildfires. We see that many locations, but certainly in the Arctic. And because that sea ice recedes, we're seeing coastal erosion that affects port infrastructure. And then finally, what scientists believe is as that polar ice cap diminishes, it weakens what they call the Arctic oscillation. So it's the jet stream. So we've been introduced to polar vortexes and things. When that jet stream gets a little wobbly, it really changes the weather patterns in the mid-latitudes. So there's a lot of things that happen climatically in the Arctic that impact globally.
So I noticed that COP29 in Baku this week is devoting an entire pavilion to the Arctic environment. But this is also becoming a commercial and strategic opportunity, if I'm not mistaken.
You are absolutely right. And let's just take this from the lens of Russia, and particularly the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin. This is the contradiction. Vladimir Putin sees climate change as 100% economic benefit. Not only it's a benefit to a new global shipping route, potentially the Northern Sea route, but it also taps into greater access to Russian Arctic energy reserves. That's very much concentrated on the Yamal Peninsula with the LNG project, but also the critical minerals that are in the Arctic. And again, we can find this in Alaska as well: zinc, iron ore, these palladium, these really important 21st century critical minerals are in the Arctic, both surface and then in the seabed, subsurface. So Russia and Vladimir Putin in particular, the Arctic development is a prestige project. He has driven that Arctic development. It really is part of building Russia's great power status. So he's all in, but as you rightly noted in the beginning, the economic sanctions against Russia has reduced Western pursuit of that development, and now Moscow is increasingly turning to Beijing, and that was the thrust of our report, looking at Sino-Russian cooperation in the Arctic.
So this opens up a window then for China to advance its own interests in the North Pole, right? I mean, I wonder if you could talk about China's increasing aggressiveness in the region.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just take a quick step back, just again, the geography and the geopolitics. So the Arctic is, there's five Arctic coastal states. So it is land that surrounds ocean. Antarctica is absolutely the opposite of that. And there are five coastal states: Russia, Norway, the Kingdom of Denmark, Canada, and the United States. So the Law of the Sea Treaty is really the governing framework for the Arctic. But you have many states that, are affected by weather, want to participate in the economic development of it. And so increasingly, we're seeing growing interest from non-Arctic states like China. So in 2013, China joined an entity called the Arctic Council, which focuses on environmental protection, as an observer in 2013, and really has increasingly written about itself as a near Arctic state in its white papers and its strategy documents. And you scratch your head and you're like, how does China become a near Arctic state? Well, if you're a Chinese nationalist and you're rolling up a 15th century map, China controlled the Russian Far East. It was certainly a near Arctic state. But China sees the Arctic as what they call a new frontier, both poles, both the Arctic and Antarctica. They also see space and the seabed as these new frontiers. And so increasingly, what they want to do is have access to those resources, the energy, the minerals, the shipping, the fishing resources. And in order to have access and to have legitimacy to their access, they need to both collaborate with those Arctic coastal states, and Russia is the most important one because Russia has so much sort of sovereignty and territorial control over it. The only way China can really have access to the Arctic is via Russia. And so part of the unlimited partnership that we saw Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin sign in February of 2022, that has had an Arctic expression. And every time those two leaders meet, out pops out a lot of memorandums of understanding, a lot of new opportunities for collaboration in the Arctic, in science, in space, and in civil military dynamics. So you're only going to see China's footprint increase in the Arctic in the years to come.
Okay, if you've just joined us this morning, this is The Call, a regular video conversation in which we address the geopolitical issues of our time. Today, we are discussing the geopolitics of a melting Arctic with the German Marshall Fund's Heather Conley. Please feel free to put questions in the Q&A. So let's drill down a little bit on what China is doing. First of all, I think there are five ports along the northern coast, five major ports that the Russians own. And my understanding is that we're seeing reports of Chinese investment in each one of these ports, building new docks and that sort of thing. I wonder if you might help explain the significance of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, let's talk about the Northern Sea Route a little bit. It's not definitely developed as much as Mr. Putin had hoped. It is one of these, it's an opportunity, but it's also a danger because exactly as you noted, this long route does not have the port infrastructure. It was really built to have the Russians gain access to the minerals and the energy, and then to take them to local markets. It really wasn't ever constructed as a global maritime passage. But the Russians in the Northern Sea Route have put a lot of money into putting search and rescue centers across the Northern Sea Route to anticipate increased use and this port infrastructure. But remember what I told you about environmental issues, coastal erosion. Port infrastructure is really getting hit by those climate impacts as well. So what we've seen over the last 2 years is a real uptick in Chinese vessel traffic to the Arctic. We've also seen an uptick in Russia's shadow fleet, which is to avoid and evade Western sanctions against Russian energy. This is dangerous because these shadow fleets, even some of the Chinese vessels, are not using ice-hardened vessels. meaning that this is risky every time they go up, and if ships are not ready to handle the ice. So this port infrastructure has to be paid for, and thus far, a lot of shipping companies have really not seen the value in this, but China sees the long-term strategic value should something happen in the Malacca Straits or tensions in the South China Sea. They could potentially have another global shipping route. And it's all about, for China, it's all about diversification, energy, minerals, shipping, protein sources. Really, the Arctic for China is a diversification strategy.
Now, I understand that Chinese investment is going beyond just those ports and that infrastructure, but also underwater infrastructure, satellite infrastructure. I wonder if you might be able to expound on that a little for our members.
Yes, I mean, this is again the thing that what makes the Arctic so strategic, it shortens distances. So as your map showed, it certainly shortens distances for ships. It also shortens distance for missiles. And that's why during the Cold War, the United States built its missile defense architecture in Alaska, in Greenland, in the Kingdom of Denmark. It shortens those distances. This is why it is so very important for us to understand Russian and Chinese, both civilian and military collaboration, both above the water and below the water. I'm probably right now following a little bit the seabed, and many of you, I'm sure, have been. It's, the pursuit of seabed mining and potentially those critical minerals on the seabed. When you have science, when you're mapping the seabed floor, yes, it's good for economic development potentially, but it's also good if you're going to have, increased submarine activity. You're following that, but you're also able to detect undersea cables in the North Atlantic in particular. So all of this, so China may be taking a science vessel to do science research on the Arctic seabed floor, but it has so many more applications. And the more that China and Russia work together, that I think is highly problematic. The other part is there are still some contested claims about the extended outer continental shelf, and Russia has very, very significant claims. And so, if there's some contested claims about those shelves, could China support Russia? Could there be some questions about that? So all of these things really require greater scrutiny, greater transparency, and we just don't have that right now in the Sino-Russian cooperation.
One of the questions that our members are posing for us is right on theme here. It seems like China is holding all the cards in this relationship. Is Russia now a junior partner?
Oh, that is the question that I think every national security analyst is grappling with, and what it requires though is a detailed understanding. So on the one hand, this relationship between China and Russia, it is an alignment. It's not a perfect alignment. There are still frictions. There are still, tensions in that relationship. But in my view, from a Russian analytical perspective, Vladimir Putin has decided the best way to preserve Russia's great power status is to be in a relationship with Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping gives him full respect, and sort of honors that desire. But at the same time, you're absolutely right. China sees this as an opportunity, very selectively, to gain advantage where it is weak. And we see this in space cooperation. It gains that knowledge from Russia, and then it outcompetes Russia in that relationship. So it also helps, their relationship is creating an anti-Western bloc. So a perfect example of this is in satellites in space. So in the Arctic, it's really tough to have great communications in high latitudes. Our GPS systems, you need that satellite coverage. Well, China and Russia are now increasingly cooperating between the Russian system, GLONASS, and Baidu, and the Chinese system. Now they're creating systems that can jam GPS and anti-satellite weapons, and they're working on separating their own communication systems. And we're seeing that happen in the Arctic. So I like to say the Arctic is a geopolitical bellwether. It told us very early that things were thawing right at the end of the Cold War. In 2007, it told us that things were beginning to refreeze, and the Arctic was that first example. I think we're seeing in the Arctic this relationship that's in alignment Russia is becoming more of a junior partner, but it accepts that to be part of an anti-Western bloc because both leaders see the United States. They believe we are in decline. They believe that they're in ascendancy, and they're using all of their tools to continue to do that. And we'll see that play out in the Arctic as well.
You know, the joint development of these dual-use technologies and infrastructures is frightening, but I wonder if there's any overt examples of joint military exercises in the region between China and Russia.
Oh, well, the United States has seen this very recently and over years. We've seen Sino-Russian exercising together. It first began in 2015, the first time that President Obama had actually visited Alaska. It was the United States had the chair of the Arctic Council at that time. We've had surprise exercises, and this is, again, what I'm hoping to help policymakers understand that we're going to increasingly see Sino-Russian activities in the North Atlantic as well as in the North Pacific. Again, this is nascent. I don't want to overblow it, but they're learning together, and that we're seeing, Russian exercising around the Sea of Japan in the Indo-Pacific. They're learning from one another. It's slow, it's gradual, there'll always be hesitancy, but we've seen an uptick in Chinese activities in joint military exercises in the Arctic and in Russia's big annual exercises. The other thing to watch is the Coast Guard, and this is the other thing that came out in our report. The Russian FSB has signed a cooperation agreement with the CCP Coast Guard, and they've described joint activities, search and rescue, joint activities in the Arctic. Again, we've seen MOUs. We have to watch this very carefully, what's in practice, and we don't want to blow things up. Sometimes they announce things and then they don't implement them. But I think we're going to increasingly see, because again, what does China gain? They gain access to the Arctic. Russia is their portal. Russia needs their economic and they're funding this polar Silk Road, the digital Silk Road. It is part of the Arctic, but it's just very selective. And the Chinese are getting the best price and the best access for that relationship.
Okay, another one of our members notes that Finland and Sweden are also Arctic countries, and they've recently joined NATO. NATO is clearly becoming a player out there. This is one of the rare instances of the world where NATO and China are actually sort of looking at each other across the tundra there. I'm wondering what dynamics changed with all of with the 7 of the 8 members of the Arctic Council now being NATO members.
Yeah, it is an absolutely great question. There has always been a hesitancy within NATO to talk about military Arctic security for fear for far too long, in my view. If we talked about it, we were militarizing it, and we wanted this to be a zone of peace and cooperation. You're absolutely right. The membership of Sweden and Finland has begun to change that calculation. And certainly NATO has exercised major exercises in the Barents Sea because the Article 5 commitment does reach to the Arctic Circle because of Svalbard and Norwegian territory, Canadian territory, and of course the United States. So, but NATO has been very slow. As I like to say, this is the unfunded mandate. It's the new theater that no one wants, and where budgets are very tight. And quite frankly, this is where we're in a strange position in the United States. Our capabilities are quite limited. The Navy does not have ice-hardened surface vessels. We have 1.5 icebreakers. The oldest one was built in the 70s, the heavy icebreaker, the Polar Star. The other icebreaker, which is a science vessel, really a medium icebreaker, was built in the 80s. The new icebreaker isn't going to be online until 27, 28. We signed a partnership with Canada and Finland to help accelerate icebreaker capabilities. But again, the United States, is going to rely on our allies and their capabilities in the Arctic. That's an unusual situation. And as I said, what I fear is we lost sight of the strategic imperative of the Arctic. Our adversaries, Russia and China, well, Russia never lost sight of it. China understands it. We have to understand our strategic interests there. and to put forward a smart capabilities package where we have presence there, we have eyes, and we have ears. But most importantly, we are protecting the North Atlantic and North Pacific from both Russia and China. And this is going to require a little bit more rigorous attention than I think it's received.
How many icebreakers do Russia and China have?
So I always like to say, never compare. It's always about the mission and what we need to accomplish, not necessarily, how many do you have? How many do I have? So Russia has upwards of 40 plus icebreakers. They have nuclear icebreakers, and they certainly have an incredibly ambitious icebreaking capacity that, quite frankly, they haven't been able to keep up with, in part due to the war. China is now working on its third icebreaker, so it does have now more icebreakers than the United States does. But it's also about the technology, and I think this is, again, we're building for the first time in over 40 years an icebreaker in the United States. We lost that technology, and so it's been very challenging. And then what are we building that icebreaker for? For science, for national security, and our icebreakers serve both poles, both for Antarctica as well as the Arctic. I just hope there's not an accident or something that we need to respond to, and we simply don't have the icebreakers are not in the right place, or they're not functioning. As I said, the Arctic shortens distances, but to get to the Arctic, time is your enemy. And so you really have to have those assets pre-positioned to be able to respond.
Heather, I wonder, as you look out across the expanse of the great melting Arctic, what's the big takeaway for our members here?
So the great takeaway, I like to say, it's contradiction and competition. So the contradiction is we view climate change as, something that is dramatically impactful, that we have to mitigate, we have to adjust from a business perspective. Russia views it as all opportunity. They will suffer enormously from climate change, but they see this as an economic and a strategic opportunity. They see the Arctic as the strategic commanding heights. And increasingly, China also understands the strategic imperative of this. So we have this contradiction of the Russians seeing climate as change as benefit, and we have our adversaries understanding the strategic imperative. So we need the United States, and with our allies, with our NATO allies, and of the 7 Arctic Council nations are NATO members, and Russia is the 8th member. We have a moment to solidify our alliances, to build those capabilities to protect the Arctic from a security perspective, environmental, human, as well as national security. But we have to prioritize it, and that's something that we just haven't done for a long time. There is economic opportunity, there's enormous science opportunity here, but you have to prioritize it. And I hope certainly the next administration will prioritize the Arctic.
Okay, our audience has had their morning shot of informational espresso, so we'll leave it there and tackle the day. Let me thank Heather Conley of the German Marshall Fund. Heather, thank you so much for swinging by today. Really appreciate it.
You're so welcome.
If you'd like to reach out to our guest, please see her email under the resource bar at the bottom of your screen. And a warm thank you to you, our members, for joining us today. If you have a theme you would like us to cover, please feel free to reach out to us at the email on the screen, globalintel@uschamber.com. We are planning many shows in the coming weeks and months, and we welcome your suggestions and feedback. This has been The Call, brought to you by the Global Intelligence Desk of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, asking the right questions to navigate uncertain times.